At this point in our study, we've begun to examine the individual Gospels of the New Testament to see how they each portray Jesus. Our assumption has been that each Gospel is distinctive and that it's important to see how each author individually portrays Jesus. We began with Mark, since by common assent, it was the earliest of our Gospels to be written. Mark portrays Jesus as the powerful but almost universally misunderstood Son of God, who despite common expectations had to suffer and die. We can now move on to Matthew, a gospel widely thought to be the most Jewish in its understanding of Jesus. In many ways, both Matthew and Luke are very similar to Mark. In fact, there are entire passages that the three Gospels share, sometimes telling the very same stories, word for word, the same. For that reason, scholars have long called these three books the Synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic comes from two Greek words which mean seen together. It's possible to lay these Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, side by side and see them together. They tell many of the same stories, often in the same words. As we'll see, this is not the case with the Gospel of John, which has very few stories in common with the other three. For centuries, scholars have agreed that the Synoptic Gospels have so many stories in common because they use the same sources for their information about Jesus. The reason they tell the same stories, the reason these stories are sometimes word for word the same, is because they're all using the same sources. More specifically, it's now generally thought that Matthew and Luke both had a copy of Mark available to them, and that they borrowed many of the stories that they give, stories of their accounts, from Mark, changing the stories as they deem desirable. And so the stories are often told in the same sequence, but sometimes Matthew will relocate a story to another part of the gospel, or Luke will do that, or sometimes they'll change the words. So that often the three gospels agree with one another, sometimes two of the gospels agree against the third, and sometimes all three are different, depending on who changed what. Matthew and Luke, though, have a number of stories in common between themselves that are not found in Mark. Obviously, for these stories, Mark was not the source. For the most part, these traditions involve sayings of Jesus. For example, the Lord's Prayer and the Beatitudes, found in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. Scholars now generally believe that these stories found in Matthew and Luke, but not Mark, come from a gospel document that no longer survives, which scholars since the 19th century have called Q. The Q document is a hypothetical source, in other words, it no longer exists, scholars have to reconstruct it, that provided Matthew and Luke for many of their traditions about Jesus, especially their sayings material. The document is called Q because the scholars who devised this theory in the 19th century were German scholars, and they called this special source for Matthew and Luke, with somewhat lacking in ingenuity, they called this source the source, which in German, of course, is Quelle, spelled with a Q, and hence they simply give it the short designation, Q. And so when people talk about the Q source, they're referring to this hypothetical source of Matthew and Luke. For stories that Matthew and Luke each has that are unique to its gospel, scholars posit yet additional sources. Usually they simply call Matthew's special source or sources M, and they call Luke's special source or sources L. And so, for example, Matthew alone tells the story of the wise men following the star to baby Jesus. That would have then come from M. Luke alone tells the story of the Good Samaritan, or the prodigal son. Both parables found only in Luke. That would come from L. As a result, behind our three synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in the opinion of most scholars, there were four sources, only one of which we still have: Mark, Q, M, and L. Since it appears that Matthew used Mark as one of his sources, one of the ways to study Matthew's Gospel, and Luke's as well when we get to Luke, is by seeing how it differs from its source. This is a way of studying the Gospels of Matthew and Luke that is sometimes called redaction criticism. Redaction criticism tries to look at how an author has redacted or edited his sources. And so if Mark was one of the sources, we can see how Matthew has changed Mark. The idea behind redaction criticism is that if an author liked the way a story already was, he wouldn't have changed it. If he's added something to it, taken something away from it, or changed its wording, then it's because there's something about the story that he wanted to change. So by looking at the changes, you can see what the author's vested interests were. That's the approach we'll take in this lecture toward the Gospel of Matthew, trying to see how Matthew differs from Mark in order to see what Matthew's distinctive emphases were. By way of background, let me remind you that this Gospel has been attributed traditionally to Matthew, the disciple of Jesus, who is known to be a tax collector. We don't actually know what the author's identity was. He doesn't appear, though, to have been an eyewitness to Jesus' life. As I pointed out earlier, this book is written anonymously. There are no first-person narratives in this account. And if scholars are right to say that this author used Mark for many of his stories, it's hard to imagine that the author himself was an eyewitness, as if he had relied on somebody else for recounting what Jesus had done when he had seen it himself. For these reasons, scholars are fairly unified in thinking whoever the author was, he was not one of the disciples. He appears to have been a Greek-speaking Christian, living around 80 or 85 AD, about a half century or so after the events that he narrates. Matthew's Gospel provides a distinctive portrayal of Jesus. On the one hand, as you might expect, Matthew has a similar view to Mark. Here too, as in Mark, Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, whose entire life looked forward to his death, which was necessary to bring about salvation. Matthew has many of the same stories and therefore much of the same theology as Mark. But there are different emphases in this gospel as well, as becomes apparent at the very outset. In brief, the distinctiveness of this gospel has to do with its stress both on the Jewishness of Jesus and on his opposition to Judaism as he found it. This gospel emphasizes, far more than Mark, that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah sent from the Jewish God to the Jewish people in fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures. He gathered Jewish disciples and taught them that they had to follow the Jewish law. At the same time, Jesus opposed the Jewish teachers of his own day and condemned the way that they practiced their religion. It's this combination of a strong affirmation of Judaism, as it ought to be, and a vitriolic condemnation of Judaism as it actually was practiced, that makes Matthew's portrayal of Jesus so distinctive. Matthew's emphasis on Jesus' own Jewishness can be seen in passages that are found in Matthew that are not found in his earlier source, Mark. Let me stress again this methodological point. By adding stories to his source, Matthew has altered somewhat the overarching perspective. We saw that Mark began his gospel with the baptism of Jesus by John. Matthew doesn't begin his gospel that way. Instead, Matthew begins his gospel with a genealogy that traces the descent of Jesus. Now, genealogies are not among the most favorite reading of most students of the Bible. Who begat whom? I have to assure my own students, though, that the genealogy in Matthew, which is only 16 verses long, doesn't compare at all with some of the genealogies you get in the Hebrew Bible. First Chronicles, which begins with 9 chapters of genealogy, is a lot more names. Here, though, simply 16 verses that are well-chosen verses because the names in this genealogy are a key to Matthew's own emphasis, as becomes clear at the very beginning. Matthew's gospel begins with a verse. The book of the generation, or the genealogy, of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. He begins his gospel by stressing the intimate connection between Jesus and David and Abraham. David, of course, was the great king of the Jews who lived 1,000 years before Jesus. The great king whose descendant was supposed to be another king, a ruler of the Jews, commonly known as the son of David, the Messiah. Abraham was the father of the Jews, from whom all Jews trace their lineage. In other words, this very first verse is stressing that Jesus is Jewish, descended from Abraham, and that he's the Messiah, descended from David. The genealogy itself goes on then to establish Jesus' credentials as standing in the messianic line of the Jews. And it does so in a striking way. The genealogy begins, Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, Jacob begot Judah and his brothers, and then it goes on down to Jesse begot David the king, David begot Solomon, his son, through the wife of Uriah. Solomon begot Rehoboam, etc. And it goes on down to Jeconiah, who was begotten along with his brothers by Josiah at the time of the captivity to Babylon. After the captivity to Babylon, Jeconiah begot Salathiel, Salathiel begot Zerubbabel, etc., on down to Mathan, who begot Jacob, Jacob who begat Joseph. Joseph was the husband of Mary, from whom was born Jesus, who is called the Messiah. In other words, it's who begot whom, from Abraham to David, to the captivity in Babylon, down to Joseph, who was married to the woman who begot Jesus. It doesn't say that Joseph begot Jesus. But then comes the most striking verse of all, verse 17. So, all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. Those from David to the captivity in Babylon were 14 generations. And those from the captivity in Babylon to the Messiah were 14 generations. 14 generations between the father of the Jews, the great king of the Jews, the Babylonian captivity, and the Messiah. This genealogy seems to be showing that in every 14 generations, a significant event happens in the history of Israel. Its greatest king, its greatest disaster, the Babylonian captivity, and then its Messiah. 14 generations separating all the key events in the history of Israel. This sounds almost too good to be true, as if the Messiah had to come precisely when Jesus was born. The problem, though, is that in order to make this sequence of 14, 14, and 14 work, Matthew has had to do some creative editing. A comparison with the Hebrew Bible shows, in fact, that Matthew has dropped out some of the names from his genealogy. Chapter 1, verse 8, where Asaph begot Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat begot Joram, and Joram begot Uzziah. According to this, then, Uzziah was the son of Joram. But when you read the Hebrew Bible, First Chronicles, the 9-chapter long genealogy and Chronicles, if you dig through there, you'll find Joram and Uzziah again. But in that case, it turns out that Joram was not Uzziah's father. He was his great-great-grandfather. Why would Matthew change the genealogy that he inherited from First Chronicles? Apparently because he wanted to show that something significant happened at every 14 generations. If he included all the generations between Joram and Uzziah, then he would no longer have the 14 sequence. There are other problems with this sequence of 14 names, one of which being that the final sequence of 14, in fact, contains only 13 names. Matthew, though, is trying to make a point. And the point is not really about the historical accuracy of his genealogy. The point is about Jesus. He's trying to say that Jesus really was the Jewish Messiah descended from the venerable Jewish line of David. His genealogy is constructed in order to show that there was divine providence behind the appearance of Jesus at this particular point in time. Jesus' Jewishness continues to be at the forefront in the stories that come next in Matthew's Gospel. Stories that, again, are not found in Mark. Stories of Jesus' miraculous birth. Probably the most striking thing about these stories, as found in Matthew, is that they mirror the accounts of the birth of Moses in the Hebrew Bible. Now let me remind you what I said in an earlier lecture, that you can compare the accounts of Luke and Matthew about Jesus' birth, because they both give narratives of Jesus' birth. But the accounts are very different from one another. The stories found in Luke are not the stories found in Mark and Matthew, and vice versa. In Matthew's account, there's no word about Jesus' parents, Mary and Joseph, taking a trip from Nazareth to Bethlehem because there's a tax that Caesar Augustus has levied, and the entire world has to go register for a census, and so it just happens that weekend they're in Bethlehem. There's no account of that in Matthew. In Matthew's Gospel, Mary and Joseph just are in Bethlehem, and Jesus is born there. There's no account in Matthew's Gospel of the shepherd coming to worship Jesus. In Matthew's account, there are no shepherds. Instead, there are the wise men who come to worship Jesus. The way the story goes in Matthew's Gospel after the genealogy is that Jesus is born in Bethlehem. There are wise men who are following a star who eventually come to Bethlehem, apparently some months later, because we find out King Herod learns that these wise men have come, and he decides that he wants to kill this child who has been born. And so he sends his soldiers out, and they kill every child 2 years and under in Bethlehem. Well, why 2 years and under? If Jesus was just born last night, surely the soldiers would recognize that some toddler in the yard running around wasn't born last night. It's because these wise men, in fact, have taken months to come to Bethlehem. Joseph learns in a dream, though, that Herod is sending out the troops, and he's warned to flee, so they flee to Egypt. We're told they flee to Egypt so that God can fulfill a scripture about Jesus. Out of Egypt have I called my son. Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. When Joseph and Mary learn then that Herod has eventually died, they return. Where are they going to return? In Matthew's Gospel, they want to return to Bethlehem, presumably because it's their hometown. But they learn that the ruler now in Bethlehem is Archelaus, Herod's son, who's even worse than his father, and so they decide to relocate to Nazareth. And so the reason Jesus is raised in Nazareth is because his parents have to relocate there after fleeing back out of Egypt. These stories of Jesus' birth in Matthew, unlike in Luke, are interesting because they mirror the accounts of Moses. In Moses, too, a child is born under a hostile regime, Egypt rather than Rome. In Moses' case as well, the ruling power wants to destroy him. In Moses' case too, he's divinely protected. He sojourns in Egypt. He leaves Egypt. He goes through the water. In Moses' case, of course, it's the water of the Red Sea during the Exodus. In Jesus' case, immediately after the stories of his birth, he's baptized. In other words, it skips all those years between his infancy and his adulthood. The next story goes, he goes through the waters of baptism. And then he goes out into the wilderness to be tempted, just as Moses and the children of Israel go into the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus is 40 days in the wilderness. And then Jesus comes from the wilderness and goes up onto the mountain to deliver his teachings, his new law, just as Moses went up on Mount Sinai to deliver God's law. My point is that Matthew has told the stories about Jesus' birth precisely in order to call to mind the birth of Moses. Why the birth of Moses? Because for Matthew's gospel, Jesus is a new Moses, a new Savior of the people of Israel. Not one who stands in contradiction to or in tension with Moses himself, but a new Moses who fulfills the law of Moses and delivers its correct interpretation. Matthew doesn't understand the choice for people in his day to be between Moses and Jesus. Matthew, as we're going to see, is not propounding that followers of Jesus have to reject Judaism. On the contrary, followers of Jesus, according to Matthew, have to affirm Judaism. But it's Judaism as interpreted by Jesus. It's not a choice between Moses and Jesus. It's a choice between Moses without Jesus or Moses with Jesus. And according to the Gospel of Matthew, it's only Moses with Jesus that is the proper interpretation of the law of Moses himself. Some people have pointed out the striking fact that in Matthew's Gospel, unlike Mark and unlike Luke, in Matthew's Gospel, there are 5 major blocks of Jesus' teaching. The first of which is the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5 through 7. This material, much of it is not found in Mark. Most of this material comes from Luke. But why are there 5 blocks of his teaching? Is it to form a parallel to the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch? It's a possibility. It's important further to recognize that these stories of Jesus' birth in Matthew's Gospel are all explicitly said to fulfill the Scripture. We're told by Matthew that Jesus was born of a virgin, and we're told why. Because according to Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, a virgin shall conceive and bear a child, and you shall call him Emmanuel. There's question, of course, whether Isaiah itself was referring to the birth of a child through a virgin. When you read the text in Hebrew, in fact, it doesn't say a virgin will conceive and bear a child. The Hebrew says a young woman will conceive and bear a child, but the Christian quotation of it in Matthew indicates that she was to be a virgin. Jesus' birth fulfills Scripture. He's born in Bethlehem. Why? Well, Matthew says because it's according to the prophet Micah, who says that the Savior will come from Bethlehem. He flees to Egypt. Why? Because as I've indicated, Scripture says, Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, out of Egypt have I called my son. At every point, the events in Jesus' birth are said to fulfill Scripture. Why this emphasis found in Matthew and only in Matthew? Precisely because Matthew is trying to show that Jesus fulfills everything God predicted in the Scriptures. Jesus, in other words, is the Jewish fulfillment of the Jewish law given by the Jewish God. He's the one who, like Moses, will deliver God's law to his people. This emphasis on the law that Jesus gives is particularly found in the first block of his teaching, the so-called Sermon on the Mount. Jesus goes up on the mountain, much as Moses went up to Mount Sinai, and then delivers his teaching. He begins the Sermon on the Mount, not by espousing an entirely new teaching, but interpreting for his hearers the teachings of Moses in the so-called antitheses. The antitheses of the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is chapters 5 through 7 of Matthew. The antitheses are the beginning, partway through after he's given the Beatitudes, where he begins to interpret what Moses said and then gives his own reading of what Moses means. Jesus says, for example, you have heard it said that you shall not murder, and that whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who gets angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. You've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. I say to you, you should not even lust after a woman in your heart. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. I say to you, turn the other cheek. Jesus gives the law of Moses and then gives his interpretation of the law of Moses. These teachings are called antitheses because Jesus sets his own understanding of this teaching in opposition to other understandings of the teaching. It's not that Jesus is contradicting what Moses himself said. In other words, Jesus doesn't say, Moses said you shall not murder, but I say you should. These antitheses instead are giving alternative interpretations of the law of Moses, which get beyond the literal level, down to the point of the spirit of the law. Moses said don't kill, I say don't even get angry. Moses said don't commit adultery, I say don't even lust. Jesus wants his followers to follow not only the letter of the law, but its very spirit. Some readers have assumed that Jesus can't really be serious. Jesus can't really expect people not to get angry or not to lust. I should say, though, that Matthew, in fact, seems to think that Jesus is quite serious. Matthew gives no indication that he thinks that these are impossible commandments. Quite the contrary, Matthew indicates that Jesus' followers are to keep the law even better than the Jewish leaders of his own day. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5, verses 17 through 20, found only in Matthew, don't suppose that I came to destroy the law and the prophets. I did not come to destroy them, but to fulfill them. Truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not even a small part of the letter, will pass away from the law until it all takes place. Whoever looses one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do likewise will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Then he concludes by saying, truly I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Jesus insists that his followers keep the law and keep it even better than the scribes and Pharisees. Well, how is that possible? Matthew evidently does not think it's possible simply by making a detailed list of do's and don'ts that everybody has to follow. To some extent, following the law of God for Matthew is a very simple affair, as we learn later in the Gospel in chapter 22, where a Jewish teacher comes up to Jesus and says to him, what is the heart of the law? And Jesus quotes two of the law's commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Anyone who truly follows those two commandments fulfills the law and does so better than the scribes and the Pharisees. In fact, in this gospel, the emphasis on following the Jewish law and the emphasis on the Jewishness of Jesus himself is counterbalanced by Jesus' forceful opposition to the Jewish leaders, whom Jesus does not think follow the law very well. In fact, Jesus portrays them as hypocrites who demand that people follow the law but don't do so themselves. Particularly striking is chapter 23. Chapter 23 of Matthew shows Matthew's vehement opposition to the scribes and the Pharisees, where Jesus calls his opponents, the Jewish leaders, whitewashed sepulchres. They're clean on the outside, but filled with rot and corruption within. He calls them hypocrites who don't practice what they preach. He says that they stress what is picayune. They don't keep what is central, but try to keep little bits of the law. They strain at gnats, but they swallow at camels. They're portrayed as godless and heartless blind leaders who know the right thing to do, but don't raise a finger to do it themselves. Matthew's gospel is sometimes been thought of as being anti-Semitic because of this harsh opposition to the Jewish leaders. I should stress, though, that there's nothing in this gospel itself that condemns Jews per se. only Jewish leaders. Even in the most vitriolic attack, Jesus does not condemn the Jews per se. Probably the most poignant scene is at Jesus' own trial before Pilate, where Pilate claims that Jesus is innocent and he washes his hands of Jesus' blood, found only in Matthew. The Jewish crowds cry out, "His blood be upon us and our children." Some people have taken this as a condemnation of the Jewish people, but it's worth noting that in the context, it's the Jewish leaders that have urged the people to say this. It's the Jewish leaders who are at fault for leading the Jewish people astray. This gospel does not condemn Judaism or Jews. It condemns the Jewish leaders of Jesus' day. In conclusion, this gospel is a lot like Mark. Here too, Jesus dies as the Son of God for the sins of the world. But the emphasis here is a lot more on the Jewishness of Jesus. Jesus here is the Jewish Messiah, sent from the Jewish God in fulfillment of the Jewish law. Jesus, as the Messiah, gives the true interpretation of the Jewish scriptures to his Jewish followers. And he expects these followers to keep the Jewish law even better than the scribes and the Pharisees.
Well, I hope you were taking notes on that. All right, so questions. Is this on? Yeah. Okay, questions. You're just overwhelmed. So let me break this down for you. Now, he did a really good job. That's only a 30-minute lecture. He did a really, really good job. He started out by talking about the sources, the different sources, and this is very important. The original gospel, as he's made clear, we've talked about before, was Mark, right? It's original gospel, probably written sometime between 65 and 70. Between 65 and 70, and our best understanding of that gospel is it was probably written for Christian communities, probably in Italy, maybe in Rome or somewhere, some major city, probably Rome, something like this, forming the first gospel. And it's very interesting because that first gospel begins with a baptism of Jesus, right? This is interesting. It begins with a baptism of Jesus. The gospel he's talking about today, and that is Matthew, he says that Matthew had as one of his sources, both Matthew and Luke had as one of their sources that original gospel, the Gospel of Mark. And consequently, when you read Matthew and Mark and Luke, there are a lot of similar passages in all three because the first gospel, Mark was there, and those second two evangelists, whoever they were, had access to that gospel. And so there are a lot of parallels between those three gospels. But then he says there's another source that was not available to Mark, which Matthew and Luke actually had, and this is called Cavella, right? And it's Q. It's known as Q. It doesn't exist anymore, but there are enough parallel citations in Matthew and in Luke that appear, I mean, you know, they're almost verbatim, the way that they cite whatever it is, this text, that scholars are pretty confident that they had this other source in common as well. And then as he points out, there were sources that Matthew had in addition to these other two sources that Luke did not have, and there were sources that Luke had that Matthew did not have. And so he says this helps to explain the commonality between Mark and Matthew and Luke, but also to explain some of the differences, but not all of the differences. He says another major consideration in looking at Matthew and comparing Matthew to Luke and Mark is, what was the purpose of this author in putting this together? And the major claim that he's making here, and lots of scholars agree with him, is that Matthew was organized and written for a very Jewish audience, a very, very Jewish audience. And consequently, Jesus is portrayed as a very Jewish Messiah, in ways that he's not portrayed in Mark or in Luke. Okay? All right, so there's the sort of sources background and the purpose of this gospel. So what kind of question do you have coming out of that? You're still dazzled and dazed, aren't you, about all of this? Yeah. It's really interesting if you stop and think about it. let me give you some insight into the way that, for instance, Matthew differs from Luke. Luke is probably, again, written for a Gentile audience, not a Jewish audience, but written for a Gentile audience. Matthew is written for a Jewish audience, probably the community, the Jewish Christian community up in Antioch. Okay, church probably founded by Peter. It starts with, as he pointed out, it starts out with a genealogy, and this genealogy goes back to Abraham, the father of the Jewish peoples. Okay, he talked about that, right? It goes back to Abraham. Luke also has a genealogy, but Luke is being written for a Gentile audience. That genealogy goes all the way back to Adam. Adam, the father of all mankind. Right? You see the difference right there? Right there. And they both say that this genealogy is very important, but for Matthew, he goes back to the founder of the Jewish people, and Luke goes all the way back to the original father of all mankind. And there's just one example of how these authors are shaping these Gospels to try to get across the image of Jesus that they actually want to produce. Fascinating, isn't it? Absolutely fascinating. Yeah, go ahead.
So, Ron, why is the genealogy so important when Joseph isn't his father?
Yeah, that's really interesting. You think they would have to wind up with Mary being, coming down to Mary. Well, it's a patriarchal society, and they're tracing their lineage through the males. And as he pointed out, what's particularly in Matthew, what's trying to be shown is that there were time and time again, and especially in the Old Testament book of Isaiah, these prophets who said that a Messiah is going to come, and it's going to come from the house of David. And so if Jesus is in fact this Messiah, he has to be traced, his lineage has to be traced all the way back to the house of David, right? And in fact, Matthew goes all the way back to the founder of the Hebrew race. So this is why it's so important. But I'm always puzzled about that. I mean, if Joseph is not the father of Jesus, then what good does it do you to trace that back? Well, apparently the Jews at the time who were Christians were satisfied with that. That's not good. Yeah, right.
Was Mary from that Mary from the house of David?
Not necessarily. I don't think we know.
Boy, yeah, I agree. I've never read anything about that at all. Yeah.
I think there are a couple other women in that one.
There are, yeah, there are a couple. I think at least 2, if not 3, women in that genealogy. Marge.
Who and to what extent would any population be extremely critical of Matthew in his methodology and description?
Okay, well that's really good. For instance, the Jews who rejected Jesus as being the Messiah, those would be the ones who would say that this really doesn't. He's not the fulfillment of this Old Testament prophecy. It's not that they would deny the genealogy. They would say, yes, this genealogy is right as far as it goes, but this person that you're talking about here is not the Messiah that we were expecting, right? Because he winds up crucified on the cross, and this is not what's supposed to happen to the Messiah. Yeah, okay. Another, yeah, go ahead.
Shouldn't we remember that Jesus has to be born of a virgin? That's the problem located here.
Yeah, it's not clear if that's what the Hebrew word in Isaiah says or not. I mean, and he gestured to that as well. The Hebrew word in Isaiah, which speaks of the birth of the Messiah, says that she will be born to a young girl. That's what it says, and it's been translated as virgin in the New Testament, in the Christian New Testament. Yeah. Yes, please, Daniel.
Just out of curiosity, so every 14 generations, something big happened up until the birth of Jesus. What happened 14 generations after? Where are we at?
14 to 19 generations.
We're still waiting for that book to be written. We don't know. We don't know.
I know, I do too.
Where are we in that?
Yeah, how many years are in 14 generations? Of course, like you said, it's not exactly 14, you left some out.
Yeah, I'm ballparking. It seems like to me from Abraham down to David, Abraham's what, around 1500, something like that, and David's around the year 1000. So maybe 500 years, but don't quote me on that, something like that, yeah. Something else which is really interesting is he points out that what's being set up here, the dynamic that's being set up in the book of Matthew, is a parallel between Moses as the original leader and sort of, I don't use the word redeemer, but spiritual guide of the Jews, and then Jesus, right, and playing one off of the other, and parallels between the lives of the two. And this is really interesting. If we had had time, some of you may remember that I did a course on Luther's Critique of the Sistine Chapel. We focused upon the frescoes on the ceiling, but if we had talked about the frescoes on the two side walls, on the right-hand side of the Sistine Chapel is a life of Moses, and on the left-hand side is a life of Christ, based upon the Gospel of Matthew, right? This is very well known, this parallel, this playing off between Moses on one side and Christ on the other side. And to draw a finer point on this, what's going on is that Moses represents the Old Covenant, right? Moses, the Old Covenant, where Christ comes to Abraham and says, Abraham, if you will worship me, if you will be faithful to me, I will bless you, and your children will, they'll be numerous, and you will populate the earth. And in order to do that, in order to be faithful to Christ, or to God, the Jewish people had to offer sacrifices, they had to follow Yahweh, and they were cleansed ritualistically. That's the Old Covenant, right? And that's how they gained God's blessing under Mosaic law. Christ comes along and establishes the New Covenant, and so the Mosaic law is still, according to Matthew, it's still there, but you have to interpret Mosaic law and fulfill Mosaic law with loving your heart for God and loving your heart for one another. And now you gain salvation. In addition to being a good Jew, you gain salvation by believing that Jesus was in fact the Messiah. Right? That's the New Covenant. So you've got this parallel between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant there in Matthew. It's fascinating. If we ever get to the Sistine Chapel together, I'll point all this out. All right, any questions about that? All right, here's the final thing that's really important about Matthew, and that is you need to understand, and this is one of the beauties of the four Gospels, they are not exact replications of one another. They vary, and they vary in some very significant points. And what that's telling us is that there were a number of different Christian communities coming out of this new religion, right? And that they had different understandings of who Jesus was and different understandings of what it took in order to be a follower of Jesus in order to gain salvation. Why does this matter? Because it was, according to Matthew, if you were going to become a Christian, you had to become a Jew if you weren't a Jew already, right? This is what it means. You had to become a Jew. You had to follow all the rituals and all the ceremonies and fulfill them with love of God in your heart and love of your fellow neighbor. Paul comes along and says, oh no, you do not have to do that. All you have to do is believe that Jesus Christ was a Son of God, He was crucified, and He died, and He was resurrected, and if you believe that, you can gain salvation. And there is a huge fight in the early church over this. A huge fight in the early church over this. We've had numerous adult education classes on this, but this is why it's very important, right? This is why it's very, very important. And in the end, those Jewish leaders of the church, of the early church, says, okay, Paul, that's fine. You can take that message to the Gentiles. Right? And so that allows Christianity to spread across the Roman Empire, because otherwise, what's the attraction of, if you're a grown male, of being circumcised at the age of 56? I mean, it's just not a good selling point. Okay, any other questions? All right, we will stop here. Remember, there's no class here next Sunday. There's going to be a brunch, because you're all going to bring your best friend to church next Sunday and bring him down here and have brunch. There will be a class at 10 o'clock in the room over there if you want to go to that, okay? All right, thanks for coming.
So we might be back at your house.
That's was my first art I know, I do too, yeah.
Well, even though like there's, like, we always have our house, but, you know, whatever, we'll pick up some of the other.
He's very good, yeah. I mean, he can say a lot more, but in a certain amount of time, we gotta pick which and highlight.
And I think they're really smart because, you know, he could easily go and say 2 minutes, but they're probably.
You don't want to go over?
I was gonna write an email this weekend, I just left me, are you guys? No, you guys just kind of go. Yes, that's, we did have that before. No, we didn't. Yeah. Some schedule laws for that. Kind of things we talked about for a long time. It's happening. It's happening. I'll have to go reschedule. Nice array of options. Yeah, their little videos.
Where are they staying?
You see the one from Mount Carmel?
All way up in the.
I didn't watch them all because they were just coming so fast.
It was funny because it was, you know, videos.
Oh, yes, I did see that one. They were like, I did watch that. Oh, that's so great. And then the Jimmy Barker, they keep going.
But luckily he called me when he got home.
Yeah, I think that was a gift.
Thank you.
Jenna's coming back there.
So how you guys doing?
Good.
Life is good?
That was good. That was good. So I guess that was just so the other day, also some of my friends are just busy all the time. I just kind of happy.
They're waiting.
Traveling some and doing some things here and there. It's gorgeous. And thank you for doing the carrying of it outside. Snowblowers are good. I know. It's very fortunate.
We're actually just sort of, which is really. I don't know that.
Has she done the school?
No, she's taking behavioral counseling.
Okay.
So she's got 2 years.
So that's about 4 hours.
Just didn't work with that. So,
Gotta try to figure some stuff out sometimes.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
so she's within more of that.
It's good. Nice. Oh, that's nice.
But yeah, I like that. 5 o'clock, 4 or 5.
I would, that'd be fantastic. Because
Aren't you gonna get a daughter soon? We wanna just be able to do
They don't
what
want to take
we
care of
wanna
everything
do.
anymore. We'll go visit the kids and we'll.
Next Sunday, what do you think? Palm Springs, right?
Yeah, his sister and her husband have gone to California for a week or two and lived there for a while now. They've settled on Palm Springs. He's like, I'll just fly right in there. So they rented
Oh, that's a really small place and
I've never been in.
I like it.
Wanna come out?
They rented a big house big enough for
I'd like to
people
go
to
there.
come join us. So he said, okay.
It's hard to get in.
And then this week's gonna be a miracle.
Staying hard, it's just here.
They have a family meeting.
But it's so small.
Yeah.
That it's
Good, yeah.
real.
Footloose and fancy.
It is very nice.
I was impressed, but I just think,
I realized when I retired, well, then the next year, you know, we got married and just the houses and everything.
They were at breakfast there, they had something.
I was tired.
It is small. Yeah, but I don't. I mean, when I go in there, there's people.
Well, you know, it's for the record, it says.
Okay, so we're going to holidays.
I'm ready.
Are you doing any consulting here today?
Ready? Just,
No, I.
Gail died.
Someone's got to rush it.
I said I thought,
Yeah, and, my first year. But I had,
Full size.
Doug was in my break, so it took me a lunch.
My brother.
My brother took me to lunch, or something like that, and I ran into American bankers, retired from America. And one of them saw me and remembered when I got all this.
Yeah.
Making me an Would have, I think, hired me as a consultant for this one. Give me a phone. I've got some expertise. Thought about it, you know. Not sure I really wanted to.
You know, it's all right for some people, but if that's, you agree.
Well, I have a friend who retired from Purdue a couple years ago, and she is not ready to give up her expertise yet. She was vice president for rural management, done a whole assortment of things, and she was on the national collegiate board, and she did a lot of stuff nationwide. She wasn't ready to give all that up yet. They live in Traverse City now, so now she's an interim vice president for all of that stuff in Utah every other week. So she goes to Utah for a week, goes home to Traverse City for a week. But she wasn't ready to give it up yet.
Well, you
So-
gotta figure out how retired you want to be.
That's right, she wasn't ready. She wasn't ready.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I gotta share.
Yeah, we do too.
Great chatting with you folks.